All right, hey everybody, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm here with Slattery and Jamie Soden. My name is George Ortega, and today we're going to talk about free will, the belief in free will relative to our criminal justice system. I mean, the basic theme is that, like, to the extent that our society, our judges, um, the police, to the extent we believe in free will, essentially what we're doing is we're blaming people who absolutely have nothing fundamentally to do with what they do. We know that people commit crimes and we have to address that, but because of the belief in free will, it's our understanding that the treatment of these people, is much more harsh and unfair. And so, to the extent that our world evolves from beyond this belief in free will, we can, I think, hopefully not only create a fairer criminal justice system, but also hopefully one that's much more effective. All right, Trick. So, what do you think the biggest problem is, or what do you think the challenge is in terms of like changing the system?
I think currently in our current criminal justice system, we have more of a retributive aspect, meaning that people want to punish those who commit crimes. They feel that they're deserving of these punishments, and so it's more of a way of thinking about these people need to be punished for what they've done, rather than these people need to be rehabilitated for what they've done, or rather than they need to be prevented just to prevent them from redoing what they have done in the past as a preventative measure. The other side of that is deterrence. So we have incarceration, we have rehabilitation, we have retributive justice, which is what we're pretty much against, because people aren't truly to blame for what they've done. But then we have deterrence. So we kind of have to play to, I think, this deterrence aspect as well. And how we do that really is something that needs to be carefully calibrated. In other words, we don't want to be too extreme with our deterrence. We want to be as fair as possible because we know that the person that actually committed the crime really didn't have the control over that. That was something that was causally just they were led to. But at the same time, we understand that having some type of deterrence prevents further infractions of these types of crimes. So we have to kind of play to that to some degree, and how we do that kind of is based on our understandings of these people aren't really truly to blame. So how can we do it in such a way that these people aren't being harmed to such and such degree? So it's kind of like a balancing act we have to play there.
Okay, that sounds great. So, in other words, the main problem is that, like, with the free will belief, we add this extra element that's unnecessary, unfair, and that's harsh and cruel. In other words, the unfair element is that these people deserve to suffer because they have a free will, because they did what they did of their own free will. So, all right. So, Jamie, how does it sound like, how do you believe we can change our system so it's fairer, and still effective by overcoming this belief?
Well, first of all, we need to address the issue with how they're portrayed in the media, because when it's in the news report, right, a lot of the time you would hear the words evil or scum being used in the context of, like, what these people are, rather than um, being a product of, you know, bad chemicals, should we say.
Jamie, that's excellent. So again, like, it's not just the judges and the police and the corrections officers and all that. It's society in general. You're right. When people, are vilified by the press, people want revenge. All
Mm.
right, and so Trick, as you were saying. So basically, we have to balance it, and I think that the idea is that, like, yeah, we need reward and punish because we as human beings, respond to reward and punishment. If we think we're going to be punished for doing something, robbing a bank or something, that's going to deter us from doing it. So we absolutely need that, but again, with the free will belief, it goes from simple deterrence to much more, to kind of like adding on more punishment than is necessary.
Right.
All right, so like basically, like, so we've got a message I think that's very important. So
well, we can't remove all punishment because we need some to deter like wrongdoing in the first place, but we don't need the excessive punishment that Christian conservatives are often in favor of, like capital punishment. I mean, we don't necessarily need that to stop people from killing, because life in prison does just as well to stop that same offender from reoffending, provided that they're never let out to begin with.
Well, that's the thing. So in other words, it's deterrence, and it's also rehabilitation. So we also need the punishment for rehabilitation. In other words, if people were like would go into a jail or prison, and life would be just as good for them there, then that wouldn't deter, that wouldn't rehabilitate. All right. So, but Trick, what does the public have to hear? How does the public have to hear this to be able to like accept the message that this free will belief really is very harmful?
Well, I mean, obviously they need to understand the whole free will debate. They need to understand why people aren't truly to blame for what they've done. They need to think of people more as, especially criminals, more as somebody that has a dysfunctional part of their structure. So if we were taking somebody that's done something crazy, like killed another person, and then we found out later that they had a brain tumor that was pressing on a certain part of their prefrontal cortex, causing a problem, causing them to have these thoughts that control their actions, we would automatically not blame that person. We would put them in a psychiatric ward, or we'd put them in a place where we try to rehabilitate these problems, and we'd look at the brain, and we'd say, oh, this person had has a tumor that's causing this problem. For the free will debate, it's not a tumor. I mean, people don't always have tumors, but they have this structure that they have no control over, just like the tumor, except they have no control over the structure of their brain at that given time. So we have to kind of relate these two type of things and say they're not really that far apart from each other. They're a lot closer than we actually think they are.
That's a great point, because a lot of people believe that, well, if we get rid of this free will myth, this free will belief, then society is going to collapse. There's not going to be any kind of like anyone will say, well, you can't really hold me responsible because I don't have free will. That means you can't punish me and all that. But all right, that's the fear. Now, we already have in our society a system that acknowledges people's lack of free will. In other words, like you were suggesting, the mental health system. If somebody has, whether it's a tumor or they have an emotional diagnosis, some kind of like condition, I mean, the law takes account for that. Now, even so, I think here in the United States, the law is still, quite punitive, regardless of the mental health things, because there are a lot, I think our prisons are filled with people with diagnoses that really shouldn't be there. They should be, treated more humanely.
Exactly. And in fact, they say that the largest grouping of psychopathic people are in our criminal system, are in jail, basically. That's not saying that everybody that's in prison is a psychopath, but the largest grouping of them are in actually prison, and that those people really have an issue with their prefrontal cortex, and I think it's their amygdala is not functioning properly, and that causes these problems. So we're not really looking at that, though. We're just throwing them in prisons and saying they did wrong, and that's that. And they're in these prisons, and a lot of them are in solitary confinement, which is actually even more cruel and unusual punishment that we know that has devastating effects on their psychology and their mental health. And so we're making problems worse in our criminal system currently, especially with things like solitary confinement. So.
Absolutely. And so again, like, the medical establishment, I think understands, in other words, like people aren't blamed for having, these psychiatric conditions in the medical establishment, but like, within the criminal justice system, you're exactly right, because of this belief in free will, that very key aspect is ignored. So Jamie, let's explain in more detail for the audience why these people who commit crimes, why nobody really has a free will.
Well, no one has a free will because they can't override the conditions that caused them to behave the way they did, or say for example, your education system. Like, you learn a language, you learn like English or Spanish or whatever, but whatever language you speak was based on what language you were taught.
Exactly. All right. Did you have more to say, Jamie? Or?
Oh, go on.
All right. So like, relative to crime, for example, like, it's not an accident that kids from very poor neighborhoods and very large cities are much more likely to be involved in crimes than kids from suburban backgrounds who live, very affluent lives. I mean, like, that's a good example. So, there's certain kinds of like societal structures, the way society,
standards, yeah,
exactly. So basically, these criminals, and that's like the environmental aspect. In other words, like, we know from psychology, from biology, that organisms, human beings, we do what we do based on nature and nurture, heredity and environment. So again, for these criminals, if it's not the environment, and this could be like, they could be living, for example, in their parents make, a lot of money, but maybe one of their parents is a psychopath, and maybe they learn it from them. So like, this learning can come to them in different ways. But if it's not the learning from the environment, then obviously something is like, wrong with them in terms of genetics. And so,
Right.
like, so there's no way, that's why we don't have a free will. I mean, there's other ways to describe why we don't have a free will, because the causality, the pleasure principle.
I mean, that's bad programming, technically speaking.
Exactly. Okay, so Trick, so how, all right, so kind of like describe the kinds of changes within the criminal justice system that you envision as our world, because it's happening. It's not happening fast enough, but as our world, evolves and overcomes this belief in free will, what do you see happening, and what do you see as the effects of it?
Well, I think the whole idea of retribution within the justice system basically has to vanish. So no more people being punished just for what they've done, but rather there has to be a reason why we do things, other than these persons deserves such and such punishment. And that's primarily that's a big thing in our justice system currently. I mean, we do some rehabilitation, we do incarceration to prevent people, but we also make things a little more extreme to some degree, and we make things as punishments just because we think that kind of fulfills somebody's psychology. If someone's a victim of a crime, especially, they get something out of someone being punished. But it's that type of thing that has to kind of be removed from our psychologies. So it's not just the justice system that's problem, but it's actually the psychology of everybody around who want this vengeance or retribution to happen, because they're not really understanding that the person didn't really have control over those factors.
Exactly. I think you're right. It's not just the judges. It's not, for example, the police. The police basically, police officers, probably almost all of them have this belief in free will. And so like when they encounter a criminal, they're not going to treat that criminal with respect. They're going to act as judges immediately. They're going to they're going to impose justice and punish. You've seen these videos of police kind of like beating on people. Just so this belief in free will, first of all, it creates a lot of hatred, a lot of like unnecessary violence, disrespect. And so like in terms of changing, like the police system, the criminal police officers, they understand in terms of like law enforcement that one of the strategies they use is called like good cop, bad cop. So like, if they're trying to get information from a suspect, from someone, they may have one cop that really is like, intentionally offensive. And I think this is wrong, but they do this, kind of like really tries to scare the criminal and just like abuse the criminal. And then you have another cop that intentionally treats the criminal with respect, with understanding, with compassion, with the kind of like behavior that would naturally stem from understanding that nobody has a free will. And what they find is like this approach actually leads the suspects or the criminals to cooperate much more with what's happening. So in other words, like to the extent we overcome this belief in free will, and not only the judges, but and the corrections officers, but also the police, understand that these people that they're dealing with, on the street and all, it's not up to them. It's not, what they do is not fundamentally up to them. Then that will lead to much more respectful and hopefully much more effective police suspect interactions.
Yeah. The police interactions is pretty much just playing to the psychology of the individual to try to get information out of them or things like that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, some of the procedures that are done there, they're probably unethical to some degree. But.
Right. All right. So Jamie, in what other ways will our world change as we reform our criminal justice system with the simple, but very, very powerful acknowledgement that nobody has a free will?
Well, there does seem to be an inconsistency with laws in different countries. I mean, in some countries the drinking age is 21, like the United States of America, but in the UK, I think the drinking age is 18 and stuff. I mean, why do we have these inconsistent laws? I mean, why don't we have like a universal law that we stick to?
Yeah, and I guess that's interesting, because that's a free will related question, because you're right. I mean, like, whether you think a person, somebody should like be able to drink at 16 or at 18 or 21 really depends on where you live. In some parts of the world, I think it's completely safe to be drinking at 16. In other parts, maybe not. I mean, it's hard to say, but that's yet another reason why what we do is really determined by where we live, by our environment. All right, another way I think that that overcoming the belief in free will will make our criminal justice system much more effective is because, like, with the present system, as Jamie was saying before, the media vilifies these criminals. Society in general, we condemn them. We really hate them to a great extent, and we label them. We label them criminals. You're evil people. The media sometimes calls them monsters. And so what happens, basically if society is seeing them in that way, it's going to be much, much more likely that they're going to see themselves in that way. And like it's in terms of basic psychology, we know that self-identity,
Right.
how we view ourselves is going to influence very strongly how we act. So in other words, like if these criminals are in prison or jail for months or years, and society's telling them that they're evil people, well, that's going to work against rehabilitation, because that's they're going to see themselves, well, like I am an evil person because society's telling me that. So like that's
Yeah.
basically going to like go against their efforts to reform.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, they're going to see themselves basically as a lost cause, and once they see themselves as a lost cause, it's just going to escalate down that path. So.
Okay, and let's talk about economics. They did an experiment, I think it's like over 100 years ago in England, where basically there were, back a long time ago, they had pretty harsh penalties for pretty, not very serious crimes, you
Right.
know, that and so like then they began an experiment that they would lessen the penalties for these crimes, and naturally most people would say, and I kind of like makes sense that people feared that, oh my God, if you lessen the penalties, crime will go up, you know. So but they tried it, they did the experiment, and what they discovered actually was the crime not only went down, it went down substantially, you know. So basically, so to the extent that we are like, in other words, like somebody does a crime, and let's say out of fairness or out of effectiveness in terms of like being a deterrent, a rehabilitative factor, let's say 6 months in prison, you know, or in jail, um, sounds like the right amount of time. Okay, that's, but our free will belief may turn that into like a year, 2 years, 5 years because of this hatred element. And I mean, not only does that, I think, go against the rehabilitation of the prisoner, because then it fills them with contempt for society, you know, but I
Right.
think it's also far more expensive. I mean, like, I think this free will belief is making the criminal justice system far more expensive than it needs to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. 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 It's sort of like the death penalty as well. That uh, people think that might be a deterrent, but in reality, when you look at the stats, none of that really drives any less um, murders, for example, to happen. Statistically, in fact, I think they said that that in states that have the death penalty, there's actually um, less homicides than there are. I'm sorry, there's more homicides in states that have the death penalty than in states that don't for some reason, and they're not really sure why, but it just happens to be the stats. Uh, on average, I'm talking about here too, not just based on the state itself. And then they say that even in states that do have the death penalty, when you if you have like they I guess they did stats on 6 months prior to a um, where they put somebody to death. They do the stats on that, and then 6 months after that, and they kind of try to weigh those together to see if there's a deterrent effect. And it turns out there isn't a deterrent effect there either. So it's, as a deterrent, there's certain things that seem like they might be a deterrence, but in reality, they're not really much of a deterrent.
Okay, so it's basically we're saying, yeah, that like, you know, this whole death penalty thing is based on this very harmful belief in free will. It's, you know, people hate the criminals, and so they want them put to death. And all right, let's talk rehabilitation, um, because, you know, I think the other important component is that like under the free will belief, you know, the understanding is, well, you know, once they're in prison, it really doesn't matter what we do or don't do, how much we help them or how little we help them. And this actually also applies to when kids are growing up. You know, we you know, with the free will belief, it goes the opinion that, well, you know, like it won't matter if we spend less on our education systems, on like, you know, on helping kids to not end up as criminals, because the rationale goes, because they have a free will. In other words, we could be spending a lot of money trying to condition, you know, these kids to not be criminals, and then when they become criminals, we could be spending a lot of money trying to condition them, to rehabilitate them, to overcome their tendencies for crime. But this free will belief prevents us from doing that, because basically people think because they have a free will, any kind of conditioning that we do won't work. Or so Trick address that. Address the, how that's like not just a harmful kind of like a belief, but it's actually just wrong. It doesn't recognize the reality of the situation.
Right, right. I mean, it's just flat out basically a total mistake, and it's a mistake in thinking that we're some agents that have control over who and what we are, and we aren't. We're totally causal, and everything interplays with each other. So when we say rehabilitation, we're talking about all of our learning, the way we teach. So we're talking about teaching people different behaviors, and behaviors come about through these type of people learning different things. They learn, for example, a new way to do something, and that changes their behavior to be able to take that path that they haven't seen prior. So a lot of crimes that occur happen because people have a really tunnel vision. They don't see other options in front of them. They have to steal this X to get to eat, for example, because they don't see the other lines that they can take. They don't see those variables, and just educating people on those other options alone gives them different tools. It gives them a different tool set that they can use to not take the path that's going to cause the problems. And then there's the people with the psychological disorders like psychopathy and things like that, where it might take pharmaceuticals, or it might take. Jamie sent me an interesting video where they might install microchips in the future to replace dysfunctional parts of the brain, and that's an interesting idea to think about in the future of how rehabilitation could happen, and we have to look at the ethics of that and all that, but we have to understand that these are just causal variables that lead people to different outcomes.
Exactly. Okay, so the point is, yes, we don't have a free will, but that does not mean that we're not able to change, by the way other people treat us, by various programs. In other words, like, if prisoners, while they're in prison, are educated on why what they did was wrong and unnecessarily wrong, and if they're educated on better ways to navigate their lives, that's going to work. So, right. Jamie, what are some of the ways? What are some of the things I think the prisoners need to learn that they're not learning now because of this free will belief?
Well, the obvious is to be, they need to be told that their actions are harmful, and they need to be told that, there is a better way to live life than to go around, continuing down the path that they've been going down.
Yeah, and actually, you just like another point we haven't dealt with yet is like it's actually the reason why many people commit crimes, because a lot of crimes aren't about like robbing a bank. A lot of crimes are like assaults on other people or like harming other people. And when you look at those kinds of crimes, you kind of like quickly realize that many of them, perhaps most of them, are committed because the people are attributing the criminals, the people who commit the crimes, are attributing free will to the person, to the victim. In other words, they're saying to themselves, oh, well, this person of their free will did this or whatever, so like I'm going to impose justice on them. I'm going to like, harm them, take something from them because it's justice, because they have a free will. So in other words, like to the extent that like our society overcomes belief in free will, not only will our criminal justice system be fairer, more effective, but there will be less crime because we've got to try to get figures on this, but I would say at least 20, 30, 40% of all crime has to do with people attributing free will to others.
Right. Once people learn that others aren't to blame, then they kind of lose some of that anger. I think that is based on that. I think, as a matter of fact, anger itself is kind of a natural extension to being able to place blame on what someone's done to some degree.
Trick, that's a great point. We've got about a minute left, but let's talk about that briefly. Basically, with the free will belief, not only are we harming these criminals and these people who are fundamentally innocent, we're harming ourselves. When we hate, we might get a cheap like thrill or pleasure from this. It might appeal to our lower instinct, but in general, for us as individuals and for us as a society, when we hate people, when we hate groups of people based on this belief of free will, we're harming ourselves. We become a world filled with hatred, and that does nobody any good. Okay, we've got about 30 seconds left. Basically, we've been exploring why the free will belief is harmful to the criminal justice system and how overcoming it can help us create a better criminal justice system, a better society in general. We'll keep talking about this. This is George Ortega, Trick Slattery, and Jamie Soden for the Free Will, Science, and Religion podcast. We'll see you again soon. Thanks.